My name is Elena Moore, and for most of my life, my world fit into two places: the quiet suburbs of Tacoma, Washington, and the sunlit kitchen of my grandmother, Lillian Moore. I was 24 when everything changed. At the time, I was working at a local bookstore called Harvest Pages. Not glamorous, not lucrative, but filled with warmth and the scent of aged paper. It was the kind of place Grandma would have loved. She always said that books had more truth than most people, and I believed her. Still do. My mom, Sharon, and I had never been particularly close. Our conversations were mostly logistical: what bills needed paying, what groceries were low, and whether I was still wasting my time at the bookstore instead of applying to law school like she had. Dad had left when I was 10, and ever since then, Mom wore stress like a second skin. But Grandma Lillian? She was my anchor. She raised me every summer, fed me when Mom forgot, and always looked me in the eyes when I talked, like what I was saying mattered. Her house on Cedar Hill felt timeless: floral curtains, mismatched teacups, and an old grandfather clock that ticked louder than the silence between my mother and me. Every Sunday, I drove over for tea and pie. Even when her arthritis grew worse and her memory began to flicker, she never forgot me. Never once. On one of those Sundays, something odd happened. She was in the kitchen, sitting in her creaky rocking chair, wearing that pale lavender cardigan she always loved. Her eyes had a distant gleam, like she was thinking 1,000 miles away. "Elena," she said, voice softer than usual, "you ever wonder why some stories don't get told until after we're gone?" I paused, mid-sip of chamomile. I guess some stories are just hard to tell. She nodded slowly, her fingers twitching against the cup handle. Or maybe some truths wait until the right heart is ready to hear them. I remember smiling, thinking it was just another one of her poetic musings. I didn't ask what she meant. I should have. Later that evening, as I was leaving, she hugged me a little longer than usual. Her hand trembled against my back. "You were always the bright one, Lena," she whispered. "No matter how dark it got." That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words circled my mind like crows. But I pushed them aside. Just another memory, I told myself. Another sentimental Sunday. A few weeks passed, and she fell ill. Nothing sudden, just a steady, painful decline. Mom said it was time. I refused to believe her. I was there the night she died. The hospital room was cold, antiseptic. Machines beeped steadily until they didn't. I held her hand as she slipped away, whispering how much I loved her, how grateful I was, how sorry I was for not asking more questions. The funeral came and went like a blur: roses, hymns, tears I tried to swallow. Most of the family was there, including Uncle Peter, who hadn't visited in years, and Aunt Rachel, who cried louder than anyone but barely knew Grandma's favorite color. After the service, the lawyer handling Grandma's estate, a quiet, graying man named Mr. Hargrove, approached me. "She left you something personal," he said, pulling a small sealed envelope from his briefcase. My name was written in her delicate script: Elena. My hand shook as I took it. My mother saw and narrowed her eyes. "What's that?" "I don't know," I replied truthfully. But deep down, I did know. Somehow, I knew this wasn't just another farewell or keepsake. This letter, it was the story she never told. For the next 3 days, I didn't open it. I kept it on my nightstand, next to her old picture. Every time I reached for it, fear gripped me. Fear of what might unravel. Of truths better left buried. On the 4th day, I sat in the rocking chair she left me, the one from her kitchen, and tore the seal. But I'll tell you about that later. First, you need to understand. Before that letter, I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew who she was. I had no idea how wrong I was. The envelope felt like it weighed 10 pounds, though it was no thicker than a birthday card. I sat cross-legged on the carpet of my apartment, surrounded by silence. My cat, Juniper, nestled at the edge of the couch, eyes watchful, as if even she sensed the air shifting. I ran my thumb beneath the flap and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "My dearest Elena, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I wanted to tell you everything while I still had time, but some truths are too tangled to speak aloud. I know you'll carry this with grace. You always had the heart for difficult things. Before you were born, there was someone else. Someone I never spoke of. His name was Thomas. He was your grandfather, but not the man you knew. Not George. I'm sorry. Love always. Grandma Lillian. I sat still, rereading it 3 times. I knew my grandfather. Or, at least I thought I did. George Moore, veteran fisherman, church-going man who died before I turned 5. But this letter spoke of another man. Someone named Thomas. The rest of the letter was blank. No details. No explanations. Just the raw edge of truth, like an open wound. I tried calling Mom that evening, but she didn't answer. No surprise. Since the funeral, she'd become colder, buried in estate paperwork and whispered phone calls with Uncle Peter. I didn't try again. Instead, I turned to the only person who might have known more, Mr. Hargrove, Grandma's lawyer. He agreed to meet me at his office the next day. It was a quiet, oak-paneled room downtown, lined with law books and brass lamps. He offered me water, which I declined. "I got your letter," I told him, unfolding the page. He nodded solemnly. "Lillian asked me not to read it, but I suspected it might be that one." "That one." He hesitated, then opened a drawer. "Miss Moore, your grandmother left behind a lockbox in my care. She said if you ever asked about the letter, I was to give it to you. No one else." He slid it across the desk. My name was etched in small cursive on a brass plate. With shaking hands, I took the key he handed me and unlocked it. Inside were photos, black and white, faded at the edges, letters wrapped in ribbon, and a birth certificate. I lifted the certificate first. My mother's name, Sharon and Moore, was there. But under father, it said Thomas Eldridge, not George Moore. I flipped through the photos. One showed a young woman, Grandma, smiling beside a tall man with dark hair and hauntingly familiar eyes. Eyes that looked like mine. "Do you know who he is?" I asked Hargrove. He leaned back, lacing his fingers. Only that he and Lillian were involved long before George. Thomas left, or was made to leave. That part was unclear. My mind raced. Why had Grandma hidden this? Why hadn't Mom ever said a word? I left the office with the lockbox under my arm and a head full of static. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid everything out on the kitchen table, the letters, the photos, the documents. My life, it seemed, was built on a lie. By morning, I'd made a decision. I had to talk to Mom. When she finally answered the door, her expression was tight. "I'm not here to fight," I said. "Just look at this." I handed her the birth certificate. Her face turned white. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "Grandma left it for me." "And this?" I showed her the photo. She didn't speak for a long time. Her shoulders sagged, and she walked over to the dining table like someone had removed her bones. "I was never supposed to know, was I?" I asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It was complicated, Elena." "Complicated? That's all you have." She closed her eyes. "He left before I was born." Grandma was heartbroken. When she met George, he promised to take care of her and me. He raised me like his own. We didn't speak of Thomas again. "Did you ever meet him?" I asked. "No." "Not once." "Why not?" Mom finally looked up. "Because your grandma didn't want me to." That answer didn't sit right. It felt too easy, too polished. Like something memorized over the years. I left before we could argue more. But as I walked back to my car, I noticed something odd. Across the street, a man in a tan trench coat was watching our house. When I looked directly at him, he turned and walked away. That night, I read one of the letters from the box. It was dated 1978. "Lillian, I know I've made mistakes. I shouldn't have left. But you have to understand, I was scared. Scared of what your father would do. Scared of what I'd become. I still love you. I always will. Tell her the truth someday. Please. Thomas." Another letter, dated 10 years later. "You never wrote back. But I see her sometimes. She looks just like you. I know I'm not welcome, but I'll never stop loving either of you. Please, just once, let me see her.
T.
My breath caught.
He'd seen me.
When? Where? And then the thought hit me like ice. Was that him? The man outside the house? I wasn't just uncovering old secrets. I was stepping into something still alive, still watching. And I had no idea how deep it would go. The next morning, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My face was pale, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, but there was a fire inside me now, one I couldn't extinguish. The kind that only ignites when your entire reality begins to collapse. I had to find Thomas Eldridge. I didn't know if he was alive. I didn't know if he wanted to be found. But I needed answers, not just for me, but for the girl in the photos. For Grandma. For whatever story she had been too afraid to tell me while she was alive. I started with what I had, his name and the few locations referenced in the letters. The postmarks were from Oregon, mostly from a small town called Rosefield. A quick search revealed it was a logging town nestled near the Columbia River. Barely a blip on the map. I packed a bag that night. I didn't tell Mom I was leaving. We hadn't spoken since our strained encounter. She wouldn't understand, not yet. By morning I was on the road. The 5-hour drive was quiet, the highway bordered by dense pines and cloudy skies. It felt like I was driving straight into the fog of my family's past. I clutched the last letter he'd written, a worn scrap of paper from 1988, as though it might point me in the right direction. When I arrived in Rosefield, the town was as small as it sounded. One diner, a library, and a general store. I stopped at the diner first. The waitress, an older woman named Bev, squinted at the name when I asked. Thomas Eldridge? She repeated, drying a mug. Yeah, he lived up past Route 9, near the river. But he moved out years ago. Hermit type. People didn't know much about him. Do you know where he went? I asked, trying to hide my urgency. She shrugged. Might want to try the old church records. Reverend Miller keeps archives. But if you're family, I'd tread carefully. That man carried a lot of ghosts. Her words hung in the air like smoke. I found Reverend Miller at a weathered chapel nestled behind a cluster of birch trees. He greeted me with a cautious smile and led me into a back room filled with filing cabinets and dust-covered ledgers. It smelled like paper and time. He stopped coming to service after 1990, Reverend Miller said, flipping through a registry. Said he'd lost too much. But he never left town. He handed me a yellowed envelope. It was addressed to Lillian Moore. Never sent.
Sealed.
The Reverend said Thomas had dropped it off in the late 90s, but asked that it only be passed on if the girl ever came looking. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Lillian. I saw her. Outside the bookstore in Tacoma. She was reaching for a book of poetry, and for a second, I thought time had folded over itself. She looked just like you when we first met. I wanted to say something. I almost did. But then I saw Sharon nearby, and I knew I'd never be welcome. I'm not angry anymore. Just sad. I hope one day she finds her way here. And I hope you've told her the truth. She deserves to know who she really is.
T.
My knees went weak. That had been him. I hadn't imagined the man outside the house. I left the church with a full heart and a spinning mind. If Thomas was still in town, I had to find him.
But where?
I asked around, and eventually, an old clerk at the general store pointed me toward a cabin deeper in the woods, just past the old quarry. I drove until the road turned to gravel, then dirt. The forest pressed in close, tall trees casting long shadows over the path. Finally, I saw it, a small wooden cabin with moss on the roof and a rusted wind chime swaying gently. I stepped out of the car, heart pounding. I knocked once. Nothing.
Twice.
The door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a man in his late 70s. Thin, with silver hair pulled back and sharp, familiar eyes, my eyes. His expression flickered through surprise, fear, and something softer. Elena, he said, voice cracked like old wood. I nodded.
Yes, I'm
your granddaughter. He opened the door wider, motioned me in with a trembling hand. The cabin was warm but sparse. A fire crackled in the hearth, and books lined the shelves. Old pictures sat atop the mantel, one of Grandma, another of my mother as a child. "I never thought you'd come," he said. "I never knew to," I replied. He sat down slowly in an armchair and looked at me with a mix of awe and regret. "I wanted to be in your life, Elena. But Lillian made it clear it would hurt Sharon more than help. She wanted a clean life for her daughter. And then for you." I swallowed hard. "Did you love her? My grandma?" He smiled, eyes misting. "With every piece of me. We were young, reckless. Her father didn't approve. When she got pregnant, I panicked. I left. But I came back. And by then, she was with George. He offered stability. I couldn't offer anything but apologies. And my mom never knew. She knew who I was. But she never saw me as a father. Lillian raised her to believe George was the only man who mattered." I sat across from him, hands clenched in my lap. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this," I whispered. Thomas leaned forward, eyes pleading. "You don't have to do anything, Elena. Just know the truth. I have nothing to give but that." But he was wrong. The truth was something. And now that I had it, I could never go back to the life I'd lived before. I left the cabin with 1,000 questions still unanswered. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about the past. It was about who I was now. I drove back from Rosefield in silence. No music. No calls. Just the steady hum of tires against asphalt and the relentless sound of my own thoughts crashing in waves. I had come searching for answers, and I found them. But they didn't bring peace. They brought weight. A lifetime of decisions made without me, stories rewritten, identities constructed on silence. And still, one thing kept gnawing at me. Why? Why had Grandma, my anchor, my truth-teller, allowed this lie to stretch across generations? I reached Tacoma just before sunset. The sky was bleeding pink and gold as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. I didn't even hesitate this time. I walked straight to the door and rang the bell like I had every right in the world. Mom answered with a frown that barely masked her tension. "You went to Rosefield," she said flatly. "Didn't you?"
I didn't respond.
I stepped inside. She followed, closing the door behind me like sealing a vault. "I met him," I said, turning to face her. "I met Thomas." She inhaled sharply, arms crossing. "I told you to let it go." "No, you didn't. You avoided, evaded, and deflected. You never once told me not to go, because you knew I would."
Just like you did.
Just like she did. Lillian wanted. She wanted control. I interrupted, my voice rising. She wanted to manage everyone's pain, everyone's choices. But guess what? She lied. And so did you. She protected you, Elena. Mom snapped, the cracks finally showing in her voice. She protected me. You think it was easy growing up not knowing who my father really was? He abandoned us. He left her pregnant and scared. And then he tried to walk back in when it was convenient. He didn't just leave, I said softly, pulling one of the letters from my bag and tossing it on the table. He was pushed out. She was scared too. But he came back. He wanted to know you. He watched from a distance because he thought it was the only thing left he could do. Mom stared at the letter, unread. Her eyes were glassy. "Don't you want to know the rest?" I asked.
Who he is.
Who we are. "I know who I am," she whispered. "I don't need him to define me." "But you needed to erase him to define me," I replied. "And now I don't know where I stand." She looked down, her voice almost breaking. "You don't understand, Elena. You think the truth sets you free, but sometimes it just ruins people. Your grandma made a choice she thought was best for all of us." "Maybe," I said, swallowing hard. "But that choice cost me something I can never get back." We stood in silence for a long time. Then she said something that surprised me. "Did he seem kind?" I nodded.
He did.
"Sad but kind." She sat down, staring at the letter. "I used to dream about him when I was a kid. Wondered what it would be like if he knocked on the door one day and said, 'I'm your father.' I hated myself for wanting that." "You were a child,"
I said.
You were allowed to want him, just like I'm allowed to want the truth. That night, for the first time in years, my mom and I talked, really talked, about Grandma, about Thomas, about the lies we were raised in. We cried. We yelled. We forgave, though not all at once. Healing doesn't come in waves. It comes in fragments. A week later, I returned to Rosefield. I brought Mom with me. Thomas didn't answer the door right away. When he opened it, his eyes fell on her first. Sharon, he breathed. She stood frozen for a moment. Then she stepped forward and said, I need to know who I came from. He invited us in. We spent the day piecing together a broken lineage, like archaeologists sifting through the ruins of something sacred and long buried. He told stories, showed photos, played an old tape where Grandma's voice was faint in the background, laughing. It wasn't a perfect reunion, but it was real, and that mattered. That night, I walked out onto the porch, looking up at the stars. Thomas joined me after a while. You remind me of her, he said. I get that a lot, I replied. I never stopped loving her, even when she shut the door on me. I believe you. He looked at me for a long time. Do you hate her for keeping this from you? I thought about it. I did. For a while. But not anymore. He nodded. She meant well. Most of the time, people lie because they're scared. Doesn't mean it's right, but it's human. A soft breeze rustled the trees. I'm glad I found you, I said. He smiled. I've been waiting a long time to hear that. The stars above blinked quietly, as if they too were keeping old secrets. And somewhere in the wind, I imagined Grandma's voice, gentle, knowing, and finally at peace. The next morning, I woke up feeling like the weight of the world was on my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Grandma Evelyn had always been the rock of our family, the one who kept secrets close to her heart and love even closer.
But this
was something else. I held the letter again, smoothing out its creases, reading her words over and over. Each sentence now seemed to carry a deeper meaning. There's something I never told your father, and I couldn't tell your mother either. I kept it from everyone until now. She had written those lines like she had no choice, like she'd carried this burden for decades. I stared at the bottom of the letter, at the postscript that had shaken me to my core. You have a sister, Claire. Her name is Mariah. I had to give her up for adoption before your mother was born. No one ever knew, but I followed her life from a distance. She lives in Portland, Oregon. I've left her a letter too. My hands trembled. A sister? My mom had a sister? That meant I had an aunt out there, someone I had never met, never heard of, someone Grandma had loved from afar, but never embraced. I couldn't understand why Grandma had never told anyone. What pain had she endured that kept her silent for all these years? I went into the attic and opened the old chest where Grandma used to keep her special things. Letters, faded photos, and mementos from a life that was more layered than we ever realized. In a hidden envelope with my name on it, she had enclosed a photo. A baby girl wrapped in a soft pink blanket, eyes wide and alert. Mariah, 1965, was scribbled on the back in Grandma's delicate handwriting. Tears blurred my vision. That baby was a part of my bloodline, my family, and somehow, Grandma had trusted me to carry this legacy forward. She hadn't just given me the truth, she had handed me a mission. After reading the letter, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting to Mariah, this mysterious aunt I'd never known existed. Grandma Evelyn had kept her in the shadows all her life, and now she had handed me the lantern. I had to find her. I had to know who she was, what kind of life she'd lived, and whether she even knew about us. The next morning, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, a cup of cold coffee, and a heart full of nerves. I started simple, typing in Mariah born 1965 Portland, Oregon into every people search site I could find. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to start somewhere. After hours of dead ends, duplicates, and false leads, I finally found a possible match. Mariah Dalton, age 59, a retired librarian who had lived in Portland most of her life. There was even a small profile picture, gray hair pulled back in a bun, sharp cheekbones, kind eyes. Something in her expression reminded me of Grandma Evelyn. I clicked on a local newspaper archive and found a short article from a few years ago about her retirement from the public library. It mentioned she had no known family, but was beloved by the neighborhood kids who frequented her story hours. No family. That line stung. I grabbed my phone and stared at the number listed. My thumb hovered over the call button. What would I even say? Hi, I'm your niece, and our grandma kept you a secret for 6 decades. Instead, I decided to write her a letter. It felt more personal. I wrote slowly, explaining who I was, how I found her name, and most importantly, the truth Grandma had revealed. I included a copy of the baby photo and a scan of the letter Grandma had written. Every word I wrote felt like a bridge being built, fragile, but full of purpose. I mailed the letter the same day. Then came the waiting. Each day I checked the mailbox like a child waiting for a birthday card. Days turned into a week. Then 2. I started to fear I'd crossed a boundary she didn't want crossed. Maybe she didn't believe me. Maybe she was angry. Or maybe she just needed time. But then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I found a cream-colored envelope tucked between bills and grocery flyers.
It was addressed to me.
My hands shook as I opened it. The first line nearly made me drop the paper. Dear Lily, I've waited my whole life for this letter. I sat at the edge of my bed, rereading Mariah's letter over and over, hardly believing her words were real. Dear Lily, I've waited my whole life for this letter. She went on to say that she had always wondered if someone out there knew about her, if maybe one day someone in the family would reach out. She never thought it would happen. She said she had long ago accepted that Evelyn had buried her away for good. Her handwriting was neat, but her words trembled with the kind of emotion you can't fake. I don't hate your grandmother. I understand why she did what she did. But it hurt. And it still does. Reading that line was like taking a punch to the chest. I thought of Grandma Evelyn's teary eyes in the hospice, how her voice cracked when she spoke about shame and regret. The wound had run both ways. Mariah wrote that she wanted to meet me. She had included her phone number, address, and a warm invitation to come visit her in Portland. She even wrote, "Come see the face your grandmother tried to forget, and the sister you never knew you needed." I called her that same evening. The phone rang 3 times before a gentle voice answered. Hello. Hi, is this Mariah Dalton? Yes, this is Mariah. I hesitated. My mouth went dry. It's Lily, Evelyn's granddaughter. There was a pause. Then I heard her exhale, almost like a sigh of relief. Lily, she whispered. I hoped you'd call. We talked for an hour. Her voice was calm, measured, but I could tell she was holding back tears. She told me stories about growing up in foster care, bouncing between homes, always wondering why she wasn't wanted. She said she never stopped dreaming about the mother who left her, or the life she might have had. I told her everything I knew about Grandma Evelyn, about the family, and about the letter I found. We cried together. And then we made a plan. 1 week later, I flew to Portland. Meeting Mariah in person was like stepping into a mirror that reflected the past, present, and future all at once. She looked like Grandma Evelyn, but softer, with a gentler smile and a sadness in her eyes that made me want to hug her before I even spoke. She opened the door before I knocked, and we just stared at each other for a moment. Then she said, "You look just like her." I replied, "So, do you?" We hugged. And in that embrace, I felt something shift, something deep and ancestral, like the healing of a wound that had stretched across generations. She made tea. We sat on her porch, watching the rain, talking for hours. That night, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had found a missing piece of myself. After spending a few days with Mariah, I began to realize something that hadn't fully dawned on me before. My grandmother's legacy wasn't just about the beautiful house she left behind or the photo albums stacked in her attic. It was about the decisions she made, the secrets she carried, and the love she struggled to express. And more importantly, it was about what she left unfinished. Mariah showed me letters she had written over the years, unsent drafts addressed to Evelyn. Some were angry, some were desperate, a few were hopeful, All of them painted a picture of someone who longed not for money or closure, but for acknowledgement, for truth. "I just wanted to know why," she said one evening as we sat beneath a quilt on her couch. "Why didn't she fight for me? Why was I the one who had to pay for their mistakes?" I didn't have an answer, but I remembered something from Grandma's final week, the way she clutched my hand and said, "I hope one day you'll understand. I tried to protect everyone, even if it meant hurting someone else." It didn't justify what she did, but it made me see her as a woman shaped by fear and shame. A woman who loved deeply, but couldn't always show it in the right ways. A woman who had made choices she couldn't undo. Before I left Portland, Mariah took me to a small garden she kept behind her house. There, under a weeping willow, was a handmade bench with a plaque. It read, "For the mother I never knew, and the forgiveness I found anyway." I touched the wood gently, my eyes welling up. "She didn't leave me much," Mariah said softly, "but I learned to give myself the peace she couldn't." As I boarded the plane home, I kept thinking about that bench and about the letter Grandma left me. In a strange, painful, beautiful way, she had passed the torch to me. It was up to me now to write the ending she never could. Back home, I made some decisions of my own. I invited Mariah to visit. I called a family meeting to tell them the truth, every last word of it. There were tears, disbelief, and even some anger. But in the end, there was understanding too. And for the first time, I realized Grandma Evelyn's real legacy wasn't what she gave me. It was what she taught me through her mistakes. The power of truth. The weight of silence. The cost of hiding pain for too long. I didn't forgive her right away. But I began to see her fully, not as the perfect grandmother, but as a woman who tried her best with what she had. And in that messy truth, I found something unexpected: compassion. The kind that heals both the living and the dead. Mariah arrived in Chicago a few weeks later. I met her at the airport, holding a small bouquet of daffodils, Grandma's favorite flower. She looked nervous stepping off the plane, clutching a weathered leather bag. But when our eyes met, there was a quiet understanding between us, like we were two parts of a story finally being stitched back together. Back in my apartment, we stayed up late talking. She brought more letters. Ones Grandma had written to no one in particular. Notes scribbled in margins. Half-written journal entries. Each one peeled back another layer of the woman we both had known, yet neither of us fully understood. "She was so full of contradictions," Mariah said, tracing her fingers along one page. "She wrote about guilt and regret like they were people living inside her." "She carried it all alone," I whispered, "even when she didn't have to." We visited Grandma's grave together. I brought a new headstone, something simple but honest. It read, "Evelyn Ruth Moore, 1929 to 2025. Beloved grandmother, sister, and mother in her own way. May truth be her peace." Mariah stood beside me in silence, then placed a folded paper on the headstone. "She never knew me," she said, "but I hope she sees me now." That visit marked the beginning of something bigger. We started hosting family dinners, me, Mariah, Aunt Jen, and even some distant cousins who had lost touch over the years. We talked about Grandma. We cried. We laughed at her weird food habits. We even read some of her old letters aloud. Slowly, the pain started to lift. It didn't disappear, but it stopped defining everything. Mariah and I created a scrapbook of Grandma's life, not the curated version with only happy memories, but the real one. We included old photographs, her handwriting, even some of her unsent letters. At the end, we added a page titled, "What She Couldn't Say, We Say Now." We wrote our own reflections there, about forgiveness, loss, identity, and healing. We didn't agree on everything, but we respected the journey each of us had taken to get here. I never thought I'd gain a sister out of all this. But Mariah became one, not by blood, but by choice. One evening, we sat on my balcony watching the sunset bleed into the skyline. Mariah turned to me and said, "You know, I used to wish she had chosen differently. But now, I think everything happened the way it had to." I nodded, tears brimming. "So, we could finally meet." Healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes it looks like shared silence. Sometimes it's a laugh after a long cry. And sometimes it's simply knowing you're not alone in your questions anymore. My grandma's truth broke my heart. But what I did with it, that's what finally started to heal it. 1 year after Grandma Evelyn's passing, I stood on the porch of her old house. The paint still peeled. The wind still carried the scent of roses from the garden she once tended with such devotion. But something had changed inside me and within these walls. I had decided not to sell the house. It wasn't just bricks and memories. It was her story. My story. Mariah's story. A place where secrets were buried and unearthed, where silence had once reigned but now gave way to truth. Mariah pulled up in her car just as I opened the front door. "You're really going to keep it?" she asked, stepping out with 2 coffees in hand. "I'm going to turn it into something," I said. "A space for women who need rest. Refuge. Maybe a little truth of their own." We walked through the rooms together. The creaky floors, the faded wallpaper, the cracked window by the kitchen sink. All the imperfections felt holy now, like echoes of everything Grandma had endured. And maybe everything she had tried to protect us from, in her own flawed way. Upstairs, in her old bedroom, I kept a box on her nightstand. Inside were her letters, the original ones she left for me, the ones she never sent to Mariah, and even some addressed to herself. It was a time capsule of sorrow, wisdom, and longing. One page, in particular, still echoed in my heart. "If one day you find this and feel broken, know that I was broken too. But you have the chance to put the pieces back together." I did, but not alone. Mariah and I decided to call the place the Evelyn House. It would serve as a retreat for women healing from grief, abandonment, or generational trauma. Somewhere between a sanctuary and a second chance. Just like Grandma never had, but always wanted for others. We held the first community gathering that fall. The backyard lit with fairy lights, soft music playing, women sharing their stories by a fire pit.
Some cried.
Some laughed. All were heard. As I stood under the old willow tree, I looked up at the stars. I imagined Grandma there, watching us,
Proud.
maybe even a little surprised that out of all her secrets came so much connection. Mariah joined me with a warm cup of tea. "You know," she said, "I think this is what she was trying to do all along." "Yeah," I replied, smiling softly. "She just didn't know how." And that's okay. Because healing doesn't always start with clarity. It starts with a crack. A letter. A question. A heart broken open. The truth Grandma left behind did more than shatter the illusion. It rebuilt a legacy. Not one of hiding, but of honesty. Not of silence, but of shared voices. And as the wind rustled the trees, I could almost hear her whisper, "You were always meant to find each other." And we did.